Hey guys, it's Navonod. I'm going to be doing a heads up series. This is going to be specifically for heads up sit and goes, micro and small stakes. It's going to be just a default strategy for early blind rounds. And this first video in the series is going to focus on play in position, pre-flop and on the flop. I want to talk a little bit about open ranges. There's been a lot talked about. I don't agree with the vast majority of players that seem to be min-raising 100% of their buttons. I don't think that's the right way to go at the low stakes and the micro stakes, because the population tendency is going to be to call too often because they don't think enough about position and they don't think enough about reverse implied odds, but they put too much emphasis on immediate pot odds. So that means they're going to call wide, and that means we ought to, in my opinion, drop out the hands that are going to rely on fold equity for their profitability. So I want to get rid of the non-connecting, no high card offsuit hands and open a range of about 80%, which I listed the range that I think you should open as default. And of course, you're going to adjust that as you play and dial in on your opponent's tendencies. Dealing with 3-bets, we're definitely going to face some 3-bets at the micro stakes and the small stakes. As a general rule of thumb, your opponents will not be 3-betting often enough for value or a bluff. So when they 3-bet, they're going to be 3-betting stronger hands as a whole. Because of that, I think we want to 4-bet a pretty tight range, a pretty value-heavy range, kind of a merged range, because you'd be surprised. Most of our opponents are not going to fold that often once they 3-bet. They're going to open raise, or I'm sorry, they're going to 3-bet hands like King Jack. They're going to 3-bet like Ace 10 suited, Ace 9 suited, Ace 10 offsuit, maybe like King 10 suited, and they're not going to fold to a 4-bet. For that reason, I want to 4-bet with hands like Ace Jack and King Queen that will crush their flatting range, but I want to be willing to fold those to a 5-bet, which will very often be a jam because they're very rarely jamming light. Pocket 8s I think are good enough to 4-bet, but we're going to want to fold to a 5-bet, and I think we will have to go ahead and 4-bet and stack off with Ace Queen or Ace King, although we're probably not real thrilled at the micros to stack Ace Queen. Will be in a coin flip fairly often, and also 9s plus, and I'm not going to be real thrilled to stack pocket 9s, but I do want to 4-bet them and I don't want to fold them, and we're never going to be, frankly, that thrilled to stack off the bottom of our stack off range, sort of by definition, right? So I think the bottom should be about 9s. We should be able to call 3-bets pretty wide. We're using a min raise to open the button, so relative to the pot size and relative to our raise size, they'll raise pretty big. Our opponents will be raising like 3 times our bet usually, or pot size bets, but relative to the stack sizes in the early going, like the first and second blind round, it'll be relatively small. We'll be playing deep. We'll have a good big stack to pot ratio, which should allow us to take a lot of flops, at least in position, with like suited connectors, Jack 8 suited type hands, connectors that are middling connectors that are not necessarily suited, like 9-8, 10-9, your 10-6 suiteds, all your suited aces that aren't good enough to 4-bet, and all your suited broadways that aren't good enough to raise, and all your double broadways in general that are not good enough to 4-bet. You know, hands like Queen 10 suited, Queen Jack offsuit, Jack 10, etc. Our c-betting strategy on the flop, I think this is our main advantage over these micro stakes players. I don't think they understand what we're doing here, so we're going to be able to use a very polarized c-bet strategy without them exploiting us by doing a lot of funky things like, you know, check raising a ton or bombing the turn and then jamming a lot of rivers. We can just polarize our c-bets. We can check back our like mediocre type hands, our showdown value, and try to get it to showdown or bluff catch the turn. And we can c-bet hands probably like second pair with a great kick, like second pair with a face card kicker or better. You know, all of our top pairs or better, of course. And we can probably c-bet all of our air, because a lot of these players are just going to play very fit or fold post flop, and they're going to have wide ranges that miss flops a lot. So we're going to bet for value, we're going to bet as a bluff, but we're going to check back the hands that are probably too strong to bluff with, but they're not going to be strong enough to value bet and get called by worse very often. Now, the exceptions I'll make are going to be some of the time I'll check back an ace high, but for showdown value and to bluff catch the turn on like a raggedy flop. But some of the time I will c-bet my ace highs, and the way that I tend to break that tie is when I have some kind of like 3 to a straight, 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight, 3 to the nut flush with an ace overcard is a perfect example of a time. Like let's say the flop comes out, you have ace 9 suited, and the flop comes out 2, 3, 7 with 2 of your suit. So you've got like backdoor wheel draws, and you've got the overcard, and you've got 3 to the nut flush. I'm going to go ahead and bet there. We have to see bet some of the time with our ace highs, or it's going to be pretty tough for us to sell that we're barreling the ace that turns for value. In other words, if we always check back our aces on the flop, then we can't really bluff effectively when the ace comes on the turn. Also, some of the times, most of the time, I'm going to be checking back my bottom pairs, but some of the time I don't think our bottom pairs are going to be strong enough to do that with, and we're going to be better off just turning them into a bluff or like a 5-out semi-bluff. And usually the lower the bottom pair is, the more likely I am to turn it into a bluff, because it's great to induce, to check back and induce turn bluffs, but it's not going to be that good to induce bluffs that we can't call. So with a hand like ace deuce on a jack 5-2, I'm more likely to just go ahead and bet that, try to end the hand there, and just give up unless I improve my equity on a later street. Dealing with check raises is something that should be fairly straightforward and easy enough for us because we are c-betting a polarized range. So very basically, we're going to continue with our value range, most of our value range, and we're going to fold our air, and we're going to be defending probably just enough doing that. Of course, it does make sense to understand, or you ought to understand, what a check raise means at the micro stakes and at the small stakes. I've been playing a lot of this with my Run It Up From Nothing series. Volatile board textures, like wet, draw-heavy boards, when you get check raised by a low stakes or micro stakes fish, most of the time that's going to be a draw or a very big hand like 2+ or a set, and you should play accordingly. On a dry flop like a king 9 deuce rainbow, I think things get a little bit more interesting, because or like an ace 3-3 or a king deuce deuce type flop, our opponent's story doesn't make a lot of sense when they check raise that board, because they're just not repping a very big value range. And it's going to be very often when you see a flop of like king 9 deuce rainbow, your opponent checks, you bet, and they raise. This is going to be a very polarized range. It's going to be like the nuts, like, well, bottom set, or 2 pair, or it's going to be nothing. And on a board like king 9 deuce, what is our villain really representing when he check raises that flop? Wouldn't he have normally 3-bet pocket nines before the flop? Wouldn't he have often, I mean, he could maybe check raise like top pair, top kicker, but shouldn't he have 3-bet that pre-flop? So his play doesn't make a lot of sense. He's really repping a value range of exactly pocket 2s that didn't 3-bet pre-flop, and like king 9. So don't make the mistake, though, even though we know he's going to be bluff heavy, of coming over the top of him for a non-all-in amount, because very often when you come over the top, he's going to ship it on you and just rebluff and just steal that pot from you. But don't be afraid to make some plays. Like, go ahead and float that check raise and see if he doesn't give up on the flop or on the turn. Go ahead and float it with equity and see if you can't steal it with a big raise all in over his bet if he leads the turn. Play around with those ideas. Of course, it's going to be villain specific, but just understand that on a dry flop, your opponents are going to check raise. That's the type of board that they're going to want to bluff with air, like your ace 3-3 pair boards, your jack 7-7s. Don't be afraid to call down with like pocket 10s on a jack 7-7 when you face a check raise. The other thing is, most of the time these guys are going to want to slow play at least one street with their sets and trips. So be surprised, especially if there are no flush draws or straight draws showing. If there's no flush draws and no straight draws open, most of these players are not going to check raise. They're real big hands. So you're going to be, when you face a check raise on a dry board, you're going to be facing a bluff a very high percent of the time. Play accordingly. On wet boards and on dry flops, we're going to have to know how to deal with donk bets, especially maybe exclusive. Well, almost exclusively, and definitely especially at the low stakes and micro stakes. Some good players do have donk ranges, some don't. But all of your just really fishy players, almost all of them are going to donk bet some percent of the time. What I have found is when they donk bet on a very wet board, you can weight their range very, very heavily towards draws. Now, if it's a very volatile board, like a low-high card, and a lot of draws, something like a 7, 6, 2 with 2 of the same suit, you can also expect your opponent, who's a fish, to donk his top pairs, maybe his second pairs, mild over pairs, to, quote, protect his hand because it's vulnerable to overcards. And either way, a lot of times you're going to be able to win this pot by floating the flop. And we'll talk about turn play in a later video, but having that plan to take it away on the turn is something you're going to have to think about to play correctly on the flop. And don't be afraid to just raise your opponent's donk bets, especially on dry flops. On dry flops, when your opponent leads into the pre-flop raiser, when he's out of position, expect him to have hands like second pair with a bad kicker and some kind of like bottom pair, or maybe like pocket threes on a queen 7 deuce type board. He's probing. He's betting for information most of the time. With your air, maybe with like backdoor equity, just go ahead and give him the bad news and raise him to let him know that he's beat so he can fold. If you've got some kind of showdown value, don't be afraid to just call him. I'm going to end with just a few tips on playing against these types of opponents. Because they think so much about express odds, but they don't think about the disadvantage of reverse implied odds of playing out of position with a weak hand. Villains are going to have very wide ranges when they flat call. And they're not 3-betting as a bluff often, and they're not often 3-betting for value, so they're going to do a lot of flatting. When they flat wide, what's that mean? It means that they're going to miss a lot of flops, kind of by definition. Wide ranges don't connect real well with a lot of flops. You can expect to win a lot of pots with C-bets and barrels, especially against fit or fold type villains. Don't allow your opponent to pot control. This is going back to donk betting. Don't let him pot control out of position. One of the main advantages of playing in position is your ability to pot control, to control the size of the pot. If your opponent donks for like half pot on the flop and you've got like top pair with a good kicker, maybe call. And then when the turn breaks off and he bets real tiny, like 1/3 pot, at least click it back. Make a raise of some sort. Don't let him pot control. That's what he's trying to do. Same as if he check calls on the flop and overcard comes in the turn and he leads into you. He's probably got something like top pair on the flop that's now second pair, and he's making a weak lead. Don't be afraid to raise big as a bluff, and don't be afraid to just like click it back for value. And he sort of in this way sticks himself into calling with a weaker range than he really would have wanted to call with. He might feel priced in. So if he bets like 1/3 the size of the pot, he donks like 1/3 the size of the pot on the turn, maybe click it back or just go a little bit bigger than clicking it back with your value hands, and he's going to probably call almost all the time. Timing tells. This is just money. Almost, I would say something like 80% of the time, if your opponent flat calls pre-flop out of position and he takes forever but eventually checks, like he tank checks the flop, he is almost always checking to fold. Play accordingly. Think about checking back some of your strong value hands, because it's just always going to go bet fold when he tanks and checks. It's like he's trying to dissuade you from betting by taking his time. Hell, I've even caught myself doing this. And speed checking, like rapid fire checking when the flop comes out, is almost always somebody for whatever reason, be it a draw or second pair or bottom pair with a good kicker, is checking to call. They have a very, in their mind, very easy decision to check and call, and I still catch myself doing this also. I'm going to tell you this is like 80% accurate. Now the last thing I want to leave you with is when you're playing against fish, don't be a hero. When very often when their range looks super polarized by the river, it's not. Fish accidentally range merge like all the time. They might like bomb the flop, bomb the turn, and bomb the river. All the draws miss, and you're sitting there with like second pair or top pair with a weak kicker thinking about hero calling. Don't do it, because they take this line with like, they overvalue 2 pair They're going to overvalue like top pair, top kicker. So don't be a hero against a fish. Don't be a hero at the micro stakes would be my advice. That's going to end this video. So until next time, this is Navonod on Heads Up Sit and Goes. Good quote, LUCK exclamation point end quote.